Hello, welcome to Ray-ality TV. I'm Ram Bakari, and today I'm joined by Dylan Conley, who ran against Congressman Jim Langevin in the 2020 Democratic primary for Rhode Island's 2nd Congressional District. 2nd Congressional District is the chair of the Providence Board of Licenses and is speculated to be running for an elected office in 2022. Dylan, how are you today?
Doing real good. Thanks for having me on.
No problem. It's a pleasure of mine to have you on the show. Just diving right into it here. What made you want to get into politics?
So, it's something that I always thought I would do, but I thought I would do it when, my kids were kind of into high school and they didn't want anything to do with me anyway. And my son's only 2 years old, so I jumped the gun a little bit. I wasn't really planning on running, but 2020 hit everyone a little bit different. And so it just seemed like something that I had conviction to do. It felt like it was an important moment.
And before we start looking at the political issues in this interview, I want to highlight your first political campaign, which was versus Congressman Jim Langevin in the Democratic primary for Rhode Island's 2nd Congressional District in the 2020 election. While coming up short, you did do well for someone who had announced a little late and didn't have a war chest or name recognition like the 10-term incumbent had. Looking back on that election, what were some key things you had taken away / learned from that campaign? And with 2020 hindsight, no pun intended, what would you have done differently in the campaign?
It's one of those things when you're compelled to run, it's not really planned in advance. I mean, it's not something I stepped into thinking that there would be a likelihood of success, but really something that I thought you had to define success by what you could learn from it, the issues you could bring into the public eye. And I got to say, we built a virtual campaign headquarters. We had about 40 volunteers. I had a friend of mine that moved from Florida into my house to help me run. In 2.5 months, we raised 25 grand and we got just about 30% of the vote. And I'm really proud of that, but I'm particularly proud of one of the things we were able to do is we focused all of our money on the in-person voting because the way the mail voted was such an extended period of time, we didn't have the funds to run advertisements. So we took a very limited amount of money, but the 3 days leading up to the election, we had several 100,000 independent, unique social media interactions within the congressional district. And we did about 6 or 7% better in in-person voting versus mail. And so I think that 6 or 7% is really a measurement of what we could have done if we had time.
So more emphasis on the mail-in ballots and increasing the social media interactions?
Yeah, I mean, getting everything done sooner. And one of the things I assumed was that because it was the largest election in the sense that it's literally with the largest district, that there would be a lot more coverage. But it's hard to compete with the pandemic. The headlines everyone is drinking from a fire hose in terms of national politics and sort of the health crisis. So our campaign was having a really difficult time getting into the mainstream media to kind of let people know that this was even happening.
And I'm now looking at some of the issues. One of the big ones that were in the news lately here in local politics of Rhode Island was the charter school moratorium bill. What are your thoughts on that piece of legislation?
So, I mean, as a general rule of thumb, I don't like moratoriums because I think that comes with a level of absolutism that you have unintended, unjust consequences. I mean, specific to the larger debate of charter schools versus public schools is I think it's unfair that the word charter is used to just mean everything non-public. All of the studies seem to indicate that some charters are successful and some aren't. And I think really having a deep understanding of where charters can provide value is critical. And also a recognition that they're not a panacea. The second you get into a charter doesn't mean that your kid's going to Harvard in 10 years, right? So I think there needs to be some reality checks on what the expectations are of charters versus public schools, and also a much more informed discussion about what different types of charters are out there, what charters are successful, which charters are not successful.
And now looking at some of the arguments when it comes to this, critics of the expansion of charter schools like to argue this drains resources from public schools, while the proponents argue that charter schools give more opportunities for those parents who don't want to have their child to be forced to go to a failing public school. Polls have indicated recently that parents are more in favor of charter schools than ever before, and same with the governor and lieutenant governor are also on board with that. Just out of curiosity, why have those on the left been more and more against charter schools over the years? And an argument that the proponents like to attribute is the demand from the teachers unions that are increasing. Is it fair to attribute that part of that view to the fear of losing the support and backing from the teachers unions?
I think the teachers' unions are very powerful in politics, and rightfully so. They have one of, if not the most important jobs in all the public sector. Just thinking about schools and my son, I already think about it constantly. He's only 2 years old. I mean, just daycare. I know this is a bit off, but technically I'm still on a wait list for certain daycare facilities. He's 2 years old. We registered before he was born. So childcare and schools in general are really sort of a problem that we're trying to deal with and we're trying to develop and we're trying to improve upon. Why the left shifts so far sort of against charters, I'm not 100% sold on that. I know that some of the most vocal proponents on the left certainly hold that opinion. I think the left is much more split on how to approach that than people believe. And I think a lot of the complaints about draining resources from public schools, I think it's a bit of to blame that on charter schools and not to focus on the funding formula is to basically, put the blame in an inappropriate place. If the issue is draining of funding, let's address the funding formula and not eliminate, school choice. So school choice in a manner that actually makes sure that the funding is fair for all children, all parents, all schools makes plenty of sense to me.
I'm glad that you mentioned the issue of school choice because this leads to my follow-up on that. A prime example of those on the right who are more in favor of charter schools like to point out is a public school system like Providence's required a state takeover after years of poor performances, and what they argued was millions of dollars poured into the system that didn't improve, which they say should make the case for alternatives like charter schools and, like you had mentioned, school choice, where students aren't necessarily restricted to their educational opportunities by zip code. When it comes to school choice, where do you stand on that? And the second part of this question that has been in the news recently, should the state takeover keep going?
Yeah, so I think choice is a really important part of improvement. I think creating some level of competition, albeit direct or indirect, it just kind of lets people voice what their opinions are of what's working, what's not working. If you have no choice at all, how do you express what's working and what's not working, right? So the other thing that I think is important is there are different learners, there are different kids with different interests, different challenges, different family priorities. And I think as a general rule of thumb, one size fits all is almost a guaranteed failure. I would actually this is one of the reasons why I think it's really interesting and it's how the left pushes back on certain things and then their opinion on schools seems to be different. Where I think the national grid monopoly is a huge problem for how we address sort of our energy and our future and stuff like that and kind of Green New Deal phenomena. But really, the monopoly is what makes it so difficult to change. And yet, while we push against that monopoly, we prefer a monopoly on the school side. And something seems to be lost there to me. There's a disconnect between the philosophy of those two things.
So you're just to kind of circle back to, you're opposed to the keeping the state takeover going for the Providence Public Schools?
No, I think the state takeover needs to continue. I think as someone, I've negotiated a lot of collective bargaining agreements myself. They're incredibly difficult to manage. I think I saw that both sides were recently considering having the negotiations public. That's incredibly uncommon. I've never heard of that before. But if that will allow some sort of forward momentum to try to get all parties working together, I think that's brilliant.
And before I move on to the next topic, I had mentioned school choice in that first part, and this is one of the big issues that are on the Rhode Island State House Republicans' agenda. House Minority Leader Blake Phillippe has been pushing hard for school choice. Would you support something like that? How the Republicans are pushing for it?
I'm not familiar with what Blake Phillippe's program is, so regrettably, I just can't. I don't have an informed opinion, so I don't really want to comment one or the other.
And moving on to the next topic, another big issue in Rhode Island is the legalization of marijuana. While a lot more of those who were against this are open to it, they are probably under the idea that if you want to smoke in your own home and you aren't causing trouble and or harm to the others in public, then that's fine. That seems to be the general consensus when it comes to that. Where they seem to draw their concerns, and this has been mentioned in a few previous episodes of Ray-ality TV, are the potential rises in crime, car accidents, insurance rates from those said accidents. And an issue here in Providence is a big increase in speed bumps. It's like every 55 feet you run into a speed bump. How could these concerns be addressed, and are they legitimate concerns in your opinion?
So I don't think that those concerns are legitimate in terms of threats to public safety. I think you're actually improving public safety because you're taking something from the black market and you're putting it into a regulated scenario. So I do think that's a net improvement for public safety. In terms of concerns about increased impairment, I don't think what you're going to see is a surge of people consuming cannabis. What you'll see is people that have always been consuming cannabis being able to acquire it in a safer manner. So I don't see any sort of increase in in impairment to the public. For me, primarily the issue with cannabis regulation is equity, right? There are, I think, a lot of different groups that have been disenfranchised because of their historic relationship and usage of cannabis, and there are people in prison for possession and sale, et cetera. And I think making sure that the communities that have been negatively impacted by those historic regulations are the same communities that benefit from the change is absolutely critical.
And kind of circling back to it, is there, in your opinion, how could those first concerns brought up in the beginning of the question be addressed? Like, how could those be addressed in the process of legalizing marijuana, if it were up to you?
Sure. So I think what is probably an interesting concept is to have sort of like local franchisees where they're sort of small scale stores, similar to the way we do Class A liquor stores in the state of Rhode Island. And that would really open it up to really locals, people, instead of large companies being the benefit. It will be, friends and family, right? They'll have a, what, I'm going to try to open up this business. I can have a cannabis franchise in the state of Rhode Island. And I think that kind of gives out that equity that I was worried about. And I think because you do it similar to the way we do Class A liquor licenses, there already is a system and a structure in place for regulation. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel.
So you think the regulation could be the solution to the concerns of potential rises in car accidents, insurance rates from those said accidents too?
I don't really see impairment jumping, so I don't really think that that's actually going to happen. I'm not concerned about it.
And now looking at the another issue is the state's budget. The budget has been very inflated for years. Those on the more fiscally conservative side of the aisle argue for a state with a little over 1 million people, the budget is almost 12 to 13 billion, depending on if you look at last year's or this year's. That's more than states like New Hampshire, Maine, and Iowa that have more people and landmass than us. This is sort of a multi-part question. Why do you think the budget's so high? What could be done to fix this lingering problem? And who do you think has the best solution that matches yours on the state level?
I'm really interested to see what we do with the stimulus money. I think the stimulus money is sort of a once in a generation is probably an understatement, opportunity to really write the budget. But there's two things you always have to be concerned about with the budget. First is just your year over year spending. And then secondarily, it's what you project your incomes to be relative to what the expenses are. I think oftentimes historically, when people receive an injection of cash, they build new things. But when you build new things, there's a cost to maintain. I think if we had a laser focus on the stimulus money being used in a manner that there's long-term return on investment, what you're doing is essentially giving yourself a loan. What I mean by that is if you spend the stimulus money upfront to resolve down the road budget issues, because it's going to improve your income or at least decrease your expenses in the long run, you can have an easier balanced budget, or you can expand programming and expand sort of the outreach that you have to different communities that need different services.
And I'm kind of looking at two of the other parts of that question. Personally, why do you think the budget got so high in the first place? And who do you think has the best solution that matches yours on the state level?
I think budgets grow over time because things get stacked up on top of each other without looking at something holistically. You sort of grow inch by inch by inch. And after a while, something that was a good idea 15 years ago is just starting to exist for the sake of itself and not for the benefit that it was originally intended. So I think when you take a look at the budget, you have to try to consider ways to reorganize such that you're using those dollars efficiently. Who is someone that's really driving that on the state level? Or I haven't heard a lot of conversations about structural changes to how you manage the budget and reconsider the budget historically. And my father was the Senate Finance Chairman until this past year. So I know that it's a battle. I know that there's a lot of conversations that go on in committee meetings, and there's a lot of debate, and really changing a budget is an incredibly difficult thing to do. I always think that it's an incredible challenge that we have a part-time legislature, part-time of the year. I don't know how many corporations that would manage billions of dollars of revenue and investment that their employees only work Tuesday through Thursday in the afternoons from January to July. I think what we have is we've inherited a system that was built in the 1700s, and we just haven't bothered to update it sufficiently to the challenges we have today. And I don't think that's any fault of the people that are involved. We're all kind of walking to the systems that were created before our time, but I think that they would be able to do much better if we gave them a greater opportunity, if we gave them a livable wage, they were able to take on those jobs full time. I think you'd see these people explode in terms of their capacity.
And while we're on the topic of finances and fiscal responsibility, looking at this next topic I had in mind to discuss, this is a multi-sub issue with the umbrella issue that is over all of them. There are a lot of ambitious proposals from those in the General Assembly right now, and even on the city level that wouldn't have been in our political dialogue 10 years ago. I'm talking about proposals like a Green New Deal in Rhode Island. The Green New Deal has been explained in previous episodes as a number of other proposals that would lead to a Green New Deal, like a $15 minimum wage, housing for all, Medicare for all, and et cetera. These are the kind of things that on the national level are projected to cost billions, if not trillions. I believe the Green New Deal was projected to cost minimum 10 trillion a year. And in the minimum wages case, the Congressional Budget Office had projected it could kill jobs as well, but also lower poverty. And on the city level, there have been ideas like introducing a guaranteed basic income program for residents. And as I mentioned, this is going to be like a multi-part question. If you were elected to any office that would be responsible for addressing these issues, how would they get paid for? Is it possible, given our inflated budget and the potential negative effects these proposals could have, like eliminating jobs and resulting in major tax increases that are hidden, and other taxes like a mileage tax or a social security tax or truck tolls, speed cameras around the state, or even in Rhode Island's case, the infamous car tax?
Sure. So I think when you consider the Green New Deal and the challenge of climate change generally, you have to have an appreciation for the jurisdiction of each individual office. What a city councilor can do and should do is different from a mayor, from a senator, from a governor, from a United States senator, from the president. They all have different authorities and capacities. I think in terms of what you can do in Rhode Island, I think the most immediate opportunity is to use the stimulus money to build out green infrastructure that will have long-term return on investment. I think if you build out green infrastructure that has basically creates a long-term financial benefit, it allows you to A, address climate change right now, and then B, have more funding in the future to find out how you want to address it on a year-over-year basis instead of a one-time capital expenditure. I think municipalities and school districts have an opportunity to do that directly through their buildings. They own a lot of buildings. And that's something that you can address very, very quickly. In terms of regulations on the state level, there is always the fear that an overly regulated phenomenon will drive work away. I think that is oftentimes overstated. A lot of people are in a location because that's the location specific is where they make their money. They can't move their business just anywhere. I think understanding where Rhode Island is relative to its immediate neighbors is more important than trying to consider Rhode Island relative to the nation at large. And I think when you consider the Green New Deal and sort of the things that you want to implement immediately in Rhode Island in terms of regulation, I'm a big fan of taxing things that have negative impacts. I think the truck tolls were smart because it doesn't put money on the residents. Meanwhile, we have new funding for infrastructure that allows us to really save money in a budgetary process year over year. That allows us to expand programming to other areas, such as school funding formulas. It's hard to say this is the magic bullet for something at that scale. I think you have to tweak everywhere. And that kind of goes back to my answer on the budget generally, where I don't hear people talking about significant restructuring processes. They're talking about, maybe one tweak here, maybe one tweak there. And I think that's an insufficient scale. But the reality of that, from my perspective on the state level, is it's a part-time legislature. There's only so much you can do in that time span. So if we want to be really serious about addressing these sorts of things at scale, I actually think going to a full-time legislature is a great idea in order to address the challenges of climate change, because it's a huge, huge, huge problem.
And I'm kind of diving back towards the end of that question. You had mentioned you are in favor of the truck tolls. And however, a lot of those critics of the truck tolls, they like to bring up the concerns that it could eventually, especially if it goes up to a court and they say, oh, you can't do truck tolls. And they'll say, oh, well, this gives us the excuse to bring it to cars. And then there's the concerns of like goods costing more money since the truck tolls are going to make that more expensive. And then other things like a mileage tax, like Pete Buttigieg was proposing to potentially pay for that infrastructure plan that they had on the national level. And then in Rhode Island, we also have things like taxing on Social Security. And then there's a bill that's proposing speed cameras around the state. And then we have the infamous car tax. It seems like we can't get rid of it no matter what. Where do those fall into the concerns in your opinion?
You know, I don't really see that the truck tolls are having a negative impact. I don't really anticipate them to have a negative impact in the future in terms of business or commerce. I think they do have a positive impact on the budget, not just immediately, but in a sustainable format. I think that's critical. I think if you take that sort of analysis and you apply it to other taxes, I think they're appropriate to do whenever you're not going to force business out of the state. So again, you don't just consider what does a toll do in Rhode Island. It's are our neighbors. Do our neighbors have tolls? Is there a way that a company is going to try to avoid doing business in Rhode Island because of tolls? I just don't see that being a realistic concern. I also don't see any court challenge to tolls being realistic, considering that tolls are basically everywhere in the whole country except for Rhode Island. I think it's really just sort of a hollow threat that lobbyists like to make anytime you try to tax any of their enterprises. But I think taxes need to be smart, right? I don't think taxing Social Security necessarily makes sense because that's someone who isn't going to save that money. They're going to spend it locally. So I think taxes that kind of create sustainable revenue without decreasing individual disposable income is what I would focus on.
And would you be for getting rid of a Social Security tax and the infamous car tax?
Yeah. Both of those things are things that like they hit our bottom line. They hit, our grandparents' bottom line. And that's money. If you gave me an extra $100 a month, I would spend it in Rhode Island. It's not going to a Cayman Islands bank account. It's not going to corporate headquarters in Chicago. It's being spent in Rhode Island. So I think if you consider taxes in such a way that let's find sustainable sources of revenue that don't negatively impact disposable income for residents. I think there's opportunities out there, but you got to be brave enough to go against some really large corporations and tax some people that are very powerful.
And lastly, before I move on to the next topic, speed cameras around the state. That was a controversial bill in the state Senate introduced that got pushback from a lot of those on the left. Would you be for or against that?
If you could give me a speed camera in front of my house today, I'd go pick it up and install it myself. I have just in front of my house, it's an absolute raceway. I represent a series of municipalities and I do a ton of council meetings. Speeding through residential neighborhoods is an absolute epidemic right now. I don't think it's a gotcha phenomenon to send someone a warning ticket after their first speed and then a meaningful ticket after their second speed. And that's someone who my wife's going to get mad because I'm going to rat on her. She's gotten a few tickets on those things. And, she should slow down. I drive like a grandma. I always have, I always will. But I've got a little kid and a dog. We live across from a park and it's a raceway in front of my house. It's terrifying, absolutely terrifying. So I think safety's got to come first.
And shifting away from the political issues, I had mentioned at the top of the interview, you are speculated to be running for some kind of elected office in 2022. You had said that you haven't decided right now since it is hard to try and jumpstart a campaign in the middle of COVID. However, since the main office I have heard in those talks is for mayor of Providence in 2022, that's the big one being speculated. I'm curious to know if you do end up running for office, what would be your first choice in 2022 to run for?
I think my first choice is going to be where sort of the community informs me that I'm needed. And if I'm not needed to run for something right now, then I won't. But what people have been reaching out to me to do would be to consider running for mayor. A large part of that is because of my position on the board of licenses. I have a deep understanding of what's going on with the hospitality industry. I have some ideas that I think would do a lot to help that industry recover. So that's sort of where the outreach to me and like where I could potentially provide value really is right now. I think, when we think about this one-time injection of funds and what that means long-term for budgets across the state, I think that the next state treasurer is going to have a lot of power because they could be in a position to see the opportunity of these funds coming in, give some level of direction on how to best use them, and simultaneously try to address pension challenges. People like to talk about pension challenges as if it's only happening in Providence. It's not the case. There are dozens of communities with funding improvement plans. There are fire districts with pension problems. And I really think that you got to do two things. First, you got to make sure that the people that worked underneath the contract are paid what they're owed. And second, you got to structure it in such a way that the public can afford to pay those pensions without losing out on things like roads and schools. So I know that people don't like to hear it, but pension payments are in direct competition with funding for schools, with funding for potholes, with funding for you name it, right? So I think the next state treasurer really needs to be able to step forward, take advantage of this opportunity, and probably try to provide a solution to the pension crisis, not just for Providence, but for all of the individual municipalities throughout the state, in the same way that now Secretary Raimondo did when she was treasurer for the state of Rhode Island. You could do it for all the individual municipalities and fire districts and all those as well.
So the answer sounded like there is you're hearing the support from Mayor, but I noticed that you mentioned General Treasurer. So what I'm going to do is I got a list here. I'm going to cross off Congress because we might lose the seat.
We're going to lose the seat. Yeah,
we're going to cross off Governor because McKee's going to be almost unbeatable. We're going to we're going to cross off Secretary of State because I didn't hear any interest there. We're going to cross off Senate because there's none up in there. None of the elections up for either Senate seat. We're going to cross off Lieutenant Governor since we now have an incumbent on that. And you mentioned General Treasurer, that's open. Is this is that possibly where it could be heading, if not Mayor?
It's something that I'm interested in, but it's not something that I'm talking to anyone about. So it would be misleading for me to say that I think it's something that could happen because I don't have an account. I'm not raising money. I'm not pursuing it. I just think it's going to be a position of critical importance to Rhode Island in the next couple of years. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of where I'm at on that. There's a lot of offices out there, and I really greatly respect people that do things like school committees, city councils, et cetera, state rep, state senator. But my profession is such that I work a lot of nights. So I'm not able to do any of those positions. I would have to literally change my job. So I think something that I hope to be able to do, regardless of whether or not I run, is to provide whatever advice and support I can for people that are in those roles. I support them professionally in many communities, but if anyone sees me, knows me, has a question, is wondering about how this might work on municipal law, how this might work for a school committee, just reach out. I'm happy to help. You need help drafting legislation, whatever it is. I don't care. I don't need my name on it. I just want to help. I think people are teasing me because I got all these offices all listed out, and rightfully so. But really, it's hard. I'm trying to find where I'm going to provide value, and I don't know. The community's got to tell me. I'm not going to tell you what's right for me. You got to tell me what's right for the community.
It's funny that you mentioned that because I think I heard something about that on Representative Walsh's podcast when she was reviewing all the Lieutenant Governor applications. She pointed out, it said for LG Mayor ? Then the Twitter tag handle is Dylan2DC. So kind of going to the mayoral election a little bit, since you had mentioned a lot of people are asking you for that, and that could be it potentially. If you want to give the scoop to Ray-ality TV, we'd be happy to get it. But anyways, I digress. Usually in citywide elections, it is best to get your ducks in a row and get ready for a year-plus campaign around this time, especially since we already have a number of candidates making those moves and announcements already, like Brett Smiley, Gonzalo Cuervo, and City Councilwoman Nerva LaFortune. What time frame could we see you either officially make an announcement for a campaign for anything, or ultimately decide to sit this one out?
So I'll be quite frank, right? So this week was originally supposed to be when we have the official reapportionment announcement regarding the congressional seat, but the challenges to the census have delayed that out into September. When our congressional campaign was over, I had this week kind of circled in my calendar for when I wanted to make decisions. And here we are, that's all been moved out to September 30th. And I'm a bit frozen. One of the reasons why I think it's kind of fun that to have all these different ideas and voice them out publicly, because in a pandemic, I don't get to have these quiet conversations with friends at, Congress Tavern. It's just like on Twitter. How else do you talk to people? I think I would have to make a decision about anything in order to be realistic within the next few months. And I don't know that I'm going to have the amount of information that I want to have in order to make a hard decision within the next few months. So what I should do is have an answer pretty soon, What will happen, I don't know, because I just don't know if I'm going to be able to have the right conversations with the right people to make an informed decision anytime soon.
And kind of going back to analyzing the 2022 mayoral election, obviously it's not going to be the third congressional district like you jokingly said on April Fools. I'm trying to get this checklist off so we can narrow it down. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. So if you don't run for mayor of Providence in 2022, who would you support out of the candidates right now?
I think they're all excellent candidates. And I thought incoming Lieutenant Governor Sabina Matos was another excellent candidate. It's hard to say. I think they bring different skills to the table. I look forward to seeing them debate. I work with Councilor LaFortune now, and I'm both on the Board of Licenses and some client work, and she's always excellent to work with. I've known Brett Smiley for a long time. I've recently had the opportunity to get to know Gonzalo, and I think the city has kind of got an embarrassment of riches when it comes to incoming candidates. I will certainly have someone to choose when it gets closer. But right now, I think I'm mostly interested in hearing what each of their individual visions are.
And moving away from the political questions, this last question is one that I ask everyone on the show to keep tradition, and that is, in your opinion, what do you think Rhode Island is best known for?
I kind of feel like there's this stereotypical thing about like Raymond L.S. Patriarcha and the New England mob and all that. When I lived in Boston, there was a degree of that, and then when I lived in Florida, there was a degree of that. But I think if you're local, if you're in New England, Rhode Island for its food. Everyone's done a weekend in Providence or a weekend in Newport, and they just want to talk about the food. The food's outrageous, and I think we can do more to sort of like make that who we are. I would love to see Providence be the New Orleans of the Northeast, stuck in between Boston and New York. I think it's very realistic for us. I think we've got the talent here. We've got the right kind of real estate here. We've got the right kind of schools here for that. So yeah, I'll say the food locally, and I'll say the mob nationally.
That's an interesting answer. And that's why I love asking this question so much, because I get a different answer every time. And I still haven't heard the coffee milk one. I'm holding out to hear that one of these days. But since you mentioned food and you are here in Providence, where's your favorite place to eat in Federal Hill?
Oh, on the hill. Let's see. So I really like Andino's red sauce, like really, really like Andino's red sauce. My wife likes the pizza from Cecilia's. Venda's always the classic. The Hill's an amazing spot. I mean, you can kind of just hop from one spot to another and have one incredible meal after another. And they're going to shut down the streets again. And so I think that's going to be really cool. I think we're going to have a summer of a lot of fun. People are going to be vaccinated. They're going to be outside, and the Hill's going to be jumping. We'll have life again.
So you did mention Cecilia's, and that is a really good pizza place. I got to ask, are you a Caserta's kind of guy or a Cecilia's kind of guy now that you brought it up?
So I'm a Caserta's kind of guy. I like the kind of the crunchiness to it and all that. And it's almost like an olive oil flavor. I don't know what they do, but it's magic.
They do it really good, and they like put the cheese under the sauce. I've tried to like replicate it at home so many times with my cousin because we eat there all the time, and he's tried so many times to make a homemade version of it, and we just can't get it, and I feel disappointed. We get really close, but we don't get there with the thin, crunchy crust. Thank you once again, Dylan, for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure of mine to have you on.
Take care.
And thank you once again for watching this episode of Ray-ality TV or reading the Political Profiles article on the Anchor. If you want to see future episodes as soon as they're posted on this channel, please click the subscribe button down below along with the post notification bell icon to the right of it. And if you want to see future Political Profiles articles, please visit anchorweb.org. I'm Raymond Bakari, and I'll see you on the next episode.